Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my honor to present today Rabbi Dov Kidron, who is a very significant figure within our world today, primarily because of something that he has taken upon himself to teach, something that is related to his own mishpacha, his own family. Rav Kidron is the namesake of his great-grandfather, Rav Dov Kook, who was the brother of Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of modern Israel. And so as a result, Rav Kidron is in a unique position. Both formally, he is on the staff of what is called the Halacha Brura. It was a type of halachic work that Rav Kook began to create in his lifetime, and it has continued, a way to learn Gemara and to understand halacha. We'll talk about that in a few moments, but also to spread the knowledge of the philosophy and the teachings of Rav Kook in the broadest possible way. And he has recently become in charge of a podcast. He broadcasts a podcast on behalf of World Mizrahi about the teachings of Rav Kook, and it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome him today with the pictures behind him of his two famous ancestors, his great-grandfather, who he is named for, and also his great-great-uncle, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. So Rav Kidron, thank you for joining me today.
Shalom Aleichem, thank you very much.
So let's start with jumping right into something that I'm really very curious about, and the teachings of Rav Kook. Unfortunately, this past week on Yom Kippur, there was a very terrible and tragic series of incidents that took place in Tel Aviv, around Dizengoff and other places, where there were people who had set up places to daven. They had been doing this for several years, including from Tzohar was also part of this. And there was first a ruling in the Israeli courts that they couldn't put up a mechitza because it was sexist and it was a public place, which to an American mindset is very strange, but we need to respect the law. They put up flags to be a mechitza, but then protesters came and disrupted the tefillot to an extreme level. And it's so bothersome, the images are so troubling. And Rav Kook was a person who reached out across all boundaries to be able to try to bring some people together. What would he be saying? What would he be doing if he were around today, in your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, so this is a very, very good question to ask about Rav Kook's approach. In my podcasts, by the way, they're titled Orot Mimizrach by World Mizrahi. So there, I actually mentioned Rav Kook's approach to non-observant Jews in general. And it's true that in general, he was very mekarev, very, very drawing near everyone who possibly has any even slight interest in Judaism. But on the other hand, he also insisted on not desecrating holy things that are commonly accepted. For example, I'll tell you a story that I say in one of these podcasts, that once a photographer came to Yerushalayim, the city of Jerusalem, and he opened his shop on Shabbat. And that was the first time ever a Jew opened a shop on Shabbat. His studio, he opened on Shabbat. When Rav Kook was told about that, he called him into his office, and first he warned him with not to desecrate Shabbat, but he wouldn't listen to him. So then Rav Kook told him, I'm warning you, if you will open your shop on Shabbat, your studio, I will tell everyone not to buy from you, not to be your customers. And indeed, that threat helped. So actually, what happened now on Yom Kippur is part of the general thing that's happening now in Israel for the last several months, what they call the judicial revolution, or whatever each one calls it. And actually, I thought from the beginning that it's not about the judicial reform, it's about the character of the state of Israel. Is it going to be a more traditional state or a secular state, as some people want? So I think now these incidents that happen now on Yom Kippur actually focus into the core of this debate that's going on now. Because when they spoke about the judicial reform, it was also a big deal, but now it's actually focusing into the religious aspect of it. And now I think if I listen a little bit to the media in Israel, And I think that there's a big majority against those who made these troubles for the prayers in Tel
And
Aviv.
how would Rav Kook, how would he have addressed it if he were around today, or if something like this had chas v'shalom happened in his time? Was there an experience where he had to stand up to people who were protesting religion?
Yeah, so I think he would make a clear distinction, and it's very hard to make that distinction between those who act out of ideology, those who have a real point of truth in their ideology, and those are just troublemakers. Those who are fighting for a true ideology, he would draw near. He would not push away. But there are some people who are just like what you call troublemakers, and then we would condemn and rebuke and chastise and whatever is needed to say to them. So, but he himself wrote that it's very, very hard to tell about each person what's the inner motivation that motivates him. Is it an ideological thing, or just the evil inclination thing that drives him to do that?
Now, there are stories that I've read about Rav Kook where he would visit the kibbutz and would not eat there because of the status of kashrut. In fact, there's one story that I read again recently. I remembered it and I found it again, of the impact he had on that non-religious kibbutz, that they actually had ended up koshering their kitchen after that experience with Rav Kook, where he took this passive approach. The fact that there were threats or assumptions that there were going to be protests in Tel Aviv, would Rav Kook have advised people to go ahead with the tefillah anyways?
I think in this case, in this specific case, he would, because those who actually organized that tefillah, it wasn't just there were a few organizations. Was Chabad, Rosh Yehudi, Tzohar, as you said, many organizations organized tefillot on Yom Kippur, and the official excuse of those protesters was that they did something against the law, against what the court said, not to put a mechitza there. But in fact, they did not put a proper mechitza there, just put a few flags. And actually, even before they even started davening, those protesters came and removed these flags. And they still continued to protest. It was just an anti-religious protest. And of course, Rav Kook would severely object to that. He even published once a public letter about football and Shabbat, calling everyone not to do that or not to desecrate Shabbat. It was very important to him.
And to go back even to his background, to Rav Kook's background, he was a Talmid Muvhak, one of the exceptional students of the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin in Volozhin. He developed this extraordinary love of Tzionut. He ultimately came on Aliyah, first as the chief rabbi of Yafo, and then chosen as the chief rabbi of all of Eretz Yisrael. At the time, it was before the founding of the state of Israel. How was it that Rav Kook came from what would be a very traditional yeshiva background, where many of the people were opposed to Zionism, and he became one of the great flag bearers of Tzionut Datit, of religious Zionism today? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I addressed this in the first podcast, in the first one of the 12 pod series. What was the source of the greatness of Rav Kook? Because he started as a conventional Litvish student in Volozhin, but he was, I attributed it to his great curiosity. He was so curious, and he learned every possible thing to the maximum depth. And he learned so much, Chassidut, Kabbalah, Halacha, all areas of Torah. He was such a genius in, and he actually paved his own way. And one of the things he did was, one of the books written about him is titled The Man Against the Stream. And he actually acted against the stream because he could have been easily appointed as a great rabbi of a great town in Europe, leader of tens of thousands of Jews. And instead of that, he chose to come to Yafo to be a leader of just 5,000-6,000 Jews who actually were not even like similar to him in their Torah approach, because he really understood what's going on. Many people do not understand when there are big changes in history, such big changes take time. And most people do not realize at the time online what's going on, what's the big change that's happening right now. And Rav Kook was in such a greatness that he understood at the time that the Geulah is beginning, that the center of Jewish people is going to become in Israel. And he made the move, and he made a great impact.
And there's a famous story about Rav Kook in the Chofetz Chaim. There's actually a wonderful book about Shnei Kohanim Gdolim that talk about both Rav Kook and the Chofetz Chaim, both who were Kohanim. But there's a famous story at the Knesset Gdolah where there was some level of disrespect that was shown to Rav Kook, and as a result, the Chofetz Chaim stood up for the honor of Rav Kook.
Right.
I assume you're very familiar with this story. Would you share the story with us?
Yeah, the story was that in Jerusalem, some what would you call now extreme Haredi or whatever, extremely ultra-Orthodox people objected to Rav Kook's approach. They thought it was too lenient, too much mekarev non-religious Jews, and they harassed him. They did the bad things to him. And there was a delegation of some of them that came to the Knesset Gdolah. And when they came to the Chofetz Chaim's room, Chofetz Chaim was then the great Gadol Hador. So when they came to his room, he refused to shake their hand. He said, those who were embarrassed, those who were mevazeh, Rav Kook, I do not shake their hands. Actually, the Chofetz Chaim knew Rav Kook when he was young. And he was the one who encouraged him to become a rabbi of a town and then to learn Ilchot Kohanim. They were in very, very good relationship between them.
Now, it was at that time that Rav Kook ended up getting stuck in Europe during the World War I, and he going to England. And he was a Rav in England? Or was it?
Right. He was stuck there for 4 years. He became a rabbi in London of Machziki Adat.
Did he speak English? Did Rav Kook speak English?
I don't think he was fluent in English, but what I know about him is that he was very much behind the scenes in obtaining the Balfour Declaration for the right of the Jewish people to have a state of their own in Israel. And when that declaration was given by Balfour and the English government, so they organized an event that people came to gather up. And Rav Kook was invited there, and there he spoke. I read one sentence in English, and he said there that he did not come to thank the British government for giving us this declaration, because this is something from heaven. He's just coming to bless and appreciate the British government for being the agents for that heavenly delivery.
And much later in modern history, now Rav Amital Zatzal had a famous sikha. He was a great devotee of Rav Kook. The writings of Rav Kook, he wrote, Rav Amital being the founder of Yeshivat Har Etzion, really sustained him during the Shoah. And when he had one of Rav Kook's Sfarim with him, and that kept him going. But he wrote later in life that if Rav Kook were to look back on what has happened in B'mdinat Yisrael, Rav Amital wasn't sure that Rav Kook would assign to it the same messianic messages as Rav Kook's son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, saw in it. But he would still see it as an important, a critical moment in Jewish history, but not necessarily the Atchalta de Geula that we talk about. What's the family's Masorah on this?
Right. I think that this is indeed a very, very interesting point. What's the state of Israel in the eyes of Kook or in the eyes of other great people? So I just heard recently that Rav Soloveitchik indeed did not think that the state of Israel is Atchalta de Geula. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, correct.
So he said, okay, let's wait and see what's going to happen with that. I think Rav Kook had a different approach. Rav Kook obviously didn't see the state of Israel because he passed away in 1935. That was 13 years before the state was declared. But in his time, they obviously spoke about the state. The Zionist movement spoke for decades about the state. They even had a debate if to do it in Uganda or in Israel. So Rav Kook obviously imagined how should the state be like. And he actually prophesied, you can say prophesied in one of his passages, he writes, Medinat Israel. He's one of the first people who ever said that. And he said that Medinat Israel, the state of Israel, should represent the Jewish people as a holy nation. And that actually is the tool that will enable us to fulfill what the purpose of the Jewish people on earth. The Jewish people were given the Torah at Sinai, and the very last statement that God said to the Jewish people is, "Ve'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim vegoy kadosh." That's the purpose of giving the Torah, not for an individual person to keep it as an individual. The greatness of the Jewish people is that we can keep the Torah as a collective, as a nation, and that should be a light to the nations. And it's obvious that nowadays, in the modern era, you can't have a whole people, a whole nation performing something without a state. The state is an essential tool to carry out that purpose. So,
well, Rav Amital's point was that Rav Kook was looking at potential. And if you looked at, if Rav Kook were still alive and he were looking back at reality, there would have been a disappointment between the potential and the reality.
I'm not sure if he was disappointed. Rav Kook knew very well the reality, even in his time. He knew all these secular and those who were against Judaism, but Rav Kook saw it from a different viewpoint. He saw, he was one of the big, one of his big novelties is, I call it the collective psychology, or what's the psychology of the klal, the entire nation. He said that there's an individual soul for every person, and there's the general soul of the Jewish nation in general. So he saw in every person you can find this contradiction. Every person has an ambition to fulfill, to carry out his potential, and many people do not manage to fulfill, to actualize all their potential. And the Jewish nation as a whole also has a great potential, which is not yet fulfilled, not yet actualized, but ultimately it must come out.
And in your podcast that you're doing, how often does it come on?
So it's once a week. Every beginning of a week they release one. It's a 12 series. I think this week was the 8th or 9th one. I'm not sure.
And again, it's called Orot Mimizrach.
Orot Mimizrach, right.
Orot Mimizrach, and it's available if you go onto the Mizrahi webpage, mizrahi.org. You can find all the links to it. And who's the audience for your podcast?
Who's the audience? That's a good question. I think the audience is every English-speaking person who is interested to know who was Rav Kook and what was his approach to many things. And people can find their very interesting things. My brother, who is actually the one who encouraged me to do this, my brother is an Israeli, but he lived for a few years in America. And he told me that people there do not really know what was Rav Kook about. They obviously heard the name, but not really know what is it about. So, for example, one of the podcasts that he liked most is about vegetarianism. What was Rav Kook's opinion about vegetarianism? And if you listen to that, that's very big novelty. I think people can understand the truth in it.
But wasn't, I'm testing myself, wasn't Rav Kook's view on vegetarianism, it is a way of returning back to original Gan Eden before we ate meat?
Right. In general, that's correct. But he actually, some people mistakenly think that Rav Kook was a vegetarian himself. But that's incorrect, because he realized the difference between the possible and the fulfillment of the entire potential. Right now, there's a long distance and there's a short distance. So in the long distance, he of course said, according to Kabbalah books and according to all the sources, that we will go back, ultimately mankind will go back to the level of Adam, who was a vegetarian. But not in the soon, it's not so soon, it's behind the curtain or behind the horizon.
Are there other members of the Kook family who are teaching still the Torah of Rav Kook?
Yes, of course. There's, interestingly, Rav Kook's, nowadays you can say that the main students of Rav Kook, those who actually mostly learn his books, are those with what's called the Kippah Sruga, like the religious Zionists.
One of these also, yes.
Okay. But Rav Kook himself, if he was living today, you would call him Haredi. He was wearing a like a streimel and very, very meticulous, very frum, very. So my great grandfather, Rav Dov Kook, had also a few descendants, and there's a big side of the family that's what you can call today Haredi, and they still learn Rav Kook's teachings and books and teach, and very proud to be his students.
Now, I remember in one of the books, I think it was Sichot Rav Kook, Sichot Ariyah, there's the description of the first time that he had encountered Rav Kook. It was the time of Havdalah, and he walked in, and he was, the way I normally explain it, he was expecting to see a kibbutznik almost, and there was Rav Kook making Havdalah. I think he said he was wearing a spodek and a shtreimel, I don't remember, but that he was pronouncing Ivrit, not like I would pronounce Ivrit, pronouncing Ivrit like a Litvish Yid, Chassidish person, and this was the surprise. The people,
right? That was Rav Neria's description, and also interestingly, the Rebbe Migur, Imre Emes, Imre Emet came from Europe, and he heard these rumors that Rav Kook is so reform and draws near all the secular people. And when he met him, he said, "Wow, this is a holy person. It's a holy like a Rebbe." Didn't understand.
And let's go over for a few minutes because we don't have a lot more time. But to the Halacha Brura Institute. Now, the Halacha Brura was tied into creating Gemarot originally, if I remember, where you have the halachic materials in the back, which tie into. What was Rav Kook's vision on that?
So actually, his vision on that is part of his general approach of unity. He always wanted to unite between different things that appear to be even opposite to one another. And here, in learning Torah, it's actually until nowadays, if you go to any yeshiva, and you ask a yeshiva guy, what are you learning? Which Masechet? He'll tell you which Masechet he's learning. But then if you ask him, okay, so can you tell me some halachic conclusions? What have you learned? What's the bottom line? What should I do about this, that? They wouldn't know. Because today, learning halacha, learning Talmud became like two different professions. And Rav Kook obviously wanted to unite that also. By the way, the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, wrote his book, the Beit Yosef, on the Tur. Tur is a halachic book, and the Beit Yosef wrote on the Tur all the sources of halacha from the Gemara. Rav Kook came from the other side, from the side of the Gemara, and wanted to write on the Gemara how it leads to halacha through the Rishonim, all the opinions. And obviously, it's not a job for one person to do. But interestingly, Rav Kook's view was that on every page of Gemara, you'll have, besides the Gemara itself, on the bottom line, the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, and that's what we print nowadays. Every Gemara of Halacha Brura, which is close to almost finishing the Shas, and he himself managed to write down with his own handwriting all the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch and all the Shas, which is something that they say that sometimes he even wrote it by heart. He didn't have the Rambam in front of him, and then he gave to his students to check if he made some mistakes, and he hardly found a mistake. He knew it all by heart. And
how many years?
It's a big vision.
So he passed away in 1935. How many years has the Institute been working on this? It's not since 1935.
Right. So this institute was established in 1970, I think, by Reb Tzvi Yehuda, his son. Actually, the one who started this job was my great-grandfather, Rav Dov Kook. Even during Rav Kook's lifetime, at the end of his life, they already published Masechet Beitzah. They wanted to start that, but then for some reason they stopped. I'm not sure why. And it was renewed in 1970. And since then, it's going on. And I have the privilege of being there.
So you have in the bottom the Rambam, you have the Shulchan Aruch. In the back, you have more.
Oh, in the back, right. In back, it's an analysis of every matter with other opinions and how it ultimately comes to the bottom line halacha.
And from Rav Kook's perspective, the bottom line halacha, was it a question just bringing it together, or was the halachic study so important that Rav Kook found this to be the way to study halacha?
I think it's part of his deep understanding that knowing halacha without the sources is insufficient. Knowing the sources without halacha is obviously not practical. So if you combine the sources with the practical halacha, then you have the perfect approach.
Are these Gemarot available in the United States?
Actually, that's an interesting story. I can tell you an anecdote. I myself came to New York to a big firm that distributes books in the States. Initially, they did not want to sell these books because of the old-fashioned enmity between Haredim and Zionists. I personally think that nowadays this enmity is very becoming much weaker, and there's much more unity between the different people. But for some reason, the manager of that store did not want to accept it. I managed to convince him by showing him a video of Rav Yitzchak Yosef, the chief Sephardi rabbi in Israel, who came and praised this work, this Halacha Brura. So I told him, okay, if he praises it and he's not suspected to be some Zionist, so you can accept it. So he accepted it once, but then he does not want anymore to distribute it. So I'm looking actually for a distributor who will take the.
Someone who's watching this will come up with the idea on that.
And there's big potential for these books in America.
To this very day, that enmity, which I hope you are correct that it's dying down a bit, but for instance, in the new the Rambams, the Frankel editions of Rambams, it's amazing that none of Rav Kook's comments were included. They were specifically excluded because of that as well.
Right, but I think this is still old-fashioned. I remember when Rambam Frankel published his book. I was then at Merkaz Rav Yeshiva, and they sent him a letter asking him, how can you ignore Rav Kook's book on Shemitah, Shabbat Haaretz? That's a major book. So his answer was, if I put Rav Kook there, nobody's going to buy my books. But I think nowadays it might have changed. I hope I'm not wrong.
And when Rav Kook's writings are very difficult for non-Israeli speakers, but even for Hebrew speakers from Israel, because of his poetic language and the difficulty of his language as well. Is there more work being done on creating an easier Hebrew editions or even English editions?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, the reason Rav Kook's language is so difficult is because in his great genius, every sentence he writes is actually rooted and based on Kabbalistic terminology. So you have to know Kabbalah in order just to understand what he means. And there are actually dictionaries even published nowadays to explain the terms and the things that he uses. What does each term mean? Just to understand that it's amazing. He wrote hundreds of thousands of pages with such great depth of Kabbalistic terms that, and in a contemporary language, and that's what makes it so fascinating and so difficult also.
But I know there are translations that are coming out in English now. I've seen some of the yeshivotas there have come out with editions which have a commentary on the bottom to try to help people understand. And there's then collections as well. There's a wonderful new one a few years ago came out on Chumash, where they've collected the comments of Rav Kook and also of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook on it as well to try to give the access to it. But
right,
is this something that you think is going to continue to grow, or it's?
I'm sure I see it. As time goes by, I think more and more people are learning his matters, because you can see that it's true. It's real. It's going down to the core of the matters, and it's true things. So I'm sure the truth will spread. No, undoubtedly, inevitably.
Our time is coming to a close, and I have to again make a pitch for your series for the Orot Mimizrach, and the pitch about Rav Kook. I grew up in Bnei Akiva. I remember we were always very proud that Rav Kook had expressed positive feelings about Bnei Akiva. We always used to tease our Mizrachiists that he didn't necessarily say the same thing about Mizrachi in the same way as he did about the youth of Bnei Akiva. So Rav Kook was always a presence when I was growing up. But today, it's so very different, even with the difference in the nature of the Rabbanut versus the time of Rav Kook and then his successor, Rav Herzog, and how it is today. So I want to thank you so much, not only for your time today, but for that podcast you're creating. It's available on Apple Podcasts. I know it's there. It's available through the Mizrachi website. If you don't know how to find it, then just go over to Mizrachi.org. You'll be able to find the links there. And Rabbi Kidron, I want to thank you so very much for your time that you've given us today and for the Torah you've helped us learn about your great uncle, Rav Kook. So
thank you very, very much. It was my pleasure and honor.
It's wonderful, and thank you, and have a very good, wonderful Yom Tov coming up, and it should be a Pit Katava, should all be for good for all of Klal Yisrael, and hopefully Rav Kook's Shalom will be found in the places where we seem to have lost it in the recent weeks.
Amen, amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Kol tov.